Stitch and I have some really bad news. Before we get to the bad news in this video, I do want to go over some of the items that we've worked on for the Nova here recently. We'll start with the interior. If you watched my Race to the Rod Run videos, you'll know that we did a little temporary work out here beside this seat, since it doesn't go all the way to the door panel, with this being the seat out of a 69 Camaro Deluxe interior. We used like this really thin foam stuff and glued the headliner material to it, and as you can see, it didn't work. It was never meant to be permanent, but it just ended up looking really, really bad. So we ended up using a dense kind of almost cardboard material. It's actually the same material that this back piece is made, that goes up on the top of the back seat metal here. It's kind of like a cardboard. It's really thin, really dense, but it actually worked really well for us to wrap it in a black vinyl and get that glued and set up on the back instead of gluing it all across the front. And now we have two pieces. We've got one that runs from the floor up the fender well, and then one that goes from the top down over the top of that bottom piece. And I think that looks really good. It may not be a permanent solution either, but it's kind of the best thing we've come up with so far. And for now, I think it does look really good. The other part that we've been working on recently is the rear axle and the rear end. We took the car out a few weeks ago to drive it around the block. As soon as we got out of the driveway and onto the road, we started hearing a knocking sound coming from the back of the car. And so we've done a few different things. At first we thought it was because the U-joint between the rear end and the drive shaft weren't at the correct angles to meet up. So you have the drive shaft right here. We'll imagine this is the front of the car. This is where the drive shaft meets the rear end. So from the front of the car, you have a slope going downward from front to back. And then when it met the rear end, which is what this piece is going to represent, it was then going up from there. And you want these pieces to be the same angle. So we used angle shims on the rear axles to rotate the rear end up and get that angle the same. So now it's the same slope running from front all the way to the back of the car and the back of the rear end. Unfortunately, that didn't solve the knocking issue, so we still had some more work to do. So when that didn't work, I put a couple of posts up in two Nova Facebook groups that I'm in to see if anyone had any ideas or thoughts on what we could check for this knocking sound. And multiple people told us to check the rear axle bearings. So we drained the rear end, took the cover off, and then pulled the axles out. And we did notice on the driver's side there's a little bit of scarring on the axle where the bearing runs or rides. And so we decided that we were going to replace both rear axle bearings and seals. Just go ahead and get that done just in case. We did that, put everything back together, and still had a knocking issue. But this is where we start to feel a little dumb. We had the wheels and tires back on the car so that we could test the knocking issue and listen for the sound. And we got under the car and rotated it by hand. That's when my dad noticed that the weights that are on these wheels to balance them were hitting and rubbing against the lower rear shock mounts. That's what was causing the knocking issue. This is the weight that they're using on these wheels. They clip onto this outer rim, and they kind of stick out where this indentation is in the wheel right here around the rim. And the factory shock mounts for the leaf springs and everything, they mounted the shock lower. And so this, when the wheel was rotating, this weight was coming around and hitting it and rubbing, and you can see a little bit where it's rubbed against it and kind of messed it up. So we ended up getting a replacement set of leaf spring braces, and these are for Novas and Camaros that have converted to a multi-leaf spring set, which we have done. It brings the shock up some. It didn't bring it up enough with their factory hole, so we ended up drilling a hole a little bit higher to mount the shock into, and that got the shock high enough to clear everything. It's also not rubbing against the inside of the brake drum or anything. It looks like it might from this angle, but it's not. We have plenty of clearance. Everything's fine there. So this allowed us to alleviate that knocking sound that we were hearing. It was a much simpler issue than we initially thought, but replacing bearings and seals is never a bad thing to make sure those are good. And we did need to adjust the angle of the rear end anyway to match it up with the drive shaft running to the front of the car. After we got all that fixed, we took the Nova out for a drive to take it to a local car show, and that's where the trouble starts. We got to the car show and the car seemed to be running perfectly fine. It sounded really good. It was riding really well. It was a really smooth ride and just felt really good. We got to the show. We were driving around looking for a place to park. We had driven through the parking area, one full loop looking for a parking spot for the Nova. And we got to the end, about to go around and look again to see if anybody had left or moved. And we started hearing a really bad vibration coming from either the engine or the transmission or something. As we were driving, the vibration got increasingly worse. So we ended up pulling out of the main car show area over to a side parking lot and parking the Nova there. And then I had to come home in my mom's vehicle, get my truck, hook the trailer up, and bring the trailer down there. And we had to push the car onto the trailer so that we can get it home. We're not exactly sure what the vibration is. My dad's certain it's coming from the engine. We pulled the valve covers off. We have not broken any other push rods. Everything else on the top end looks good. So it seems like there may be something deeper in the engine that we need to get checked. My dad's thinking it may be a piston ring. So we've got to get this engine and transmission pulled out of the car and just get it taken apart, going through and get it fixed. The goal is to have a good friend of my dad who builds engines and transmissions to look through this. I don't know how that's going to work out. We're trying to get in touch with him and see if he'd be willing to look at this for us. But yeah, so that's the bad news. Engine and transmission have to come out of the Nova, which means that there won't be any local car shows for me to take the car to until all of this gets fixed. It's disappointing, but the goal, as every year, is for the rod run to get the car there, especially since we are at a much closer final product than we were last year, except for the engine issue. But if we can get it fixed, get it to the rod run, then there will be still car shows in the fall that we can take it to after that point, once we get all this situated and settled. But I wanted to kind of give y'all an update on the status of the Nova, some of the things we've worked on to get situated, and then this major issue that just happened a couple of days ago. Once we get a plan figured out for getting the engine looked at and transmission gone through and just making sure all the mechanical stuff is working properly, I'll do another video, let y'all know kind of what's going on and what the status is and what the plan is. But that's what I've got for now. It's not the best news in the world, but I wanted to let y'all know what's going on with Stitch. Thanks for watching. For now, this is Southpaw Garage, signing out.